She was born into one of Europe's richest dynasties. Yet her first lullabies were the distant echoes of cannon fire. While other royal children learned to walk across polished marble floors, Maria Beatrice of Austria-Este learned to walk while fleeing. Carried from palace to palace, border to border, chased by Napoleon's relentless advance. Exile became her childhood. Fear became her stability. And when peace finally came, it did not rescue her. It delivered her into a marriage without affection, a motherhood filled with small coffins, and a life slowly hollowed out by grief. This is the story of a princess who never found solid ground. Not in her homeland, not in her marriage, not even in her own heart. Maria Beatrice of Austria-Este entered the world on October 5th, 1792, at a moment when Europe stood on the edge of an irreversible collapse. Her birth should have been an occasion of triumph for two powerful dynasties. The Habsburg-Lorraines through her father, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Este, and the ancient Italian house of Este through her mother, Maria Beatrice d'Este, Duchess of Massa and Carrara. Together, their domains formed one of the wealthiest and culturally richest regions of northern Italy. Lands known for their marble, their music, their flourishing cities, and their centuries-old stability. But the peace that had shaped the Este inheritance was already dying. Beyond the glittering baptismal ceremonies and the diplomatic congratulations, soldiers were marching across Europe with a speed the old world had never seen. Napoleon Bonaparte was rising from an unknown Corsican artillery officer into a force that would rip apart the political map of Italy. Even before Maria Beatrice could understand the world around her, the world itself was shifting beneath her feet. In many royal families, infancy meant soft lullabies, golden cradles, and the quiet, uneventful rhythms that shaped a sheltered life. For Maria Beatrice, infancy was defined by the restlessness of adults whispering in corridors and the muffled tension that filled every room. Her caregivers rushed through their duties with an anxious precision. Her mother's letters, once filled with courtly matters, increasingly spoke of troop movements, border uncertainty, and the fear of losing ancestral lands. Although the infant princess could not comprehend these fears, she absorbed them the way children absorb the atmosphere around them. There are accounts from later years describing how sensitive she was to sudden noises, how she would stiffen at the sound of carriage wheels or footsteps in the hallway, as if anticipating another departure before anyone told her. To her, life never held still long enough to feel safe. By 1796, when she was only 4 years old, Napoleon's armies swept decisively through northern Italy. Modena fell, the Este rule collapsed, and with it collapsed the sense of permanence that had sustained her family for centuries. Her parents packed what they could, documents, jewels, a few personal belongings, and fled northward. The little girl, who should have been raised amid Renaissance palaces, instead began a wandering life shaped by urgency and fear. Those early journeys were not recorded in detail, but fragments survive. A governess noted that the young Maria Beatrice rarely cried during hurried departures. Instead, she clutched whatever toy she had been allowed to carry and stared silently at the windows as the landscape blurred by. Another attendant wrote that the princess seemed to look older than her years. She watched the adults with the eyes of someone who understood what she could not yet name. It was as if the instability around her carved itself into her character from the beginning. Fleeing to Vienna offered safety, but not stability. The imperial city was magnificent, but it was not home. Maria Beatrice was one child among many in the vast Habsburg world, none of them knowing how long peace would last or whether the political storm would reach them next. Her family's future depended entirely on diplomacy, shifting alliances, and the unpredictable tides of war. The palaces they stayed in were grand yet temporary, spaces borrowed out of necessity rather than belonging. Even as she grew old enough to speak, her vocabulary took shape around the anxieties she witnessed. She learned the names of distant cities before she learned the names of local gardens. She learned to recognize the tones adults used when bad news arrived. She understood, instinctively, that rooms filled with packed trunks meant another departure was coming. Unlike other noble children, she never learned the meaning of stability. Instead, she learned the art of adapting to uncertainty. Her father tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, continuing his administrative duties in exile, managing what remained of the Este claims, and negotiating with the Habsburg court. Her mother protected the younger children and attempted to preserve a semblance of familial warmth. But even within the household, fear lingered like an unspoken companion. Every letter from the front, every report from diplomats, carried the possibility of profound change. As the years passed, Maria Beatrice grew into a gentle, observant child. Those who met her commented on her quietness, not the lively curiosity expected of a young princess, but a watchful, cautious silence. She did not trust good days to last. She did not trust peaceful rooms to remain peaceful. Her early experiences had taught her that joy could be interrupted at any moment, replaced by hurried footsteps and the command to leave everything behind. This formative instability shaped her understanding of life. Where others saw the world as a place of predictable order, she saw it as fragile, a tapestry that could unravel without warning. When she later entered adulthood, this foundational insecurity would influence her emotions, her marriage, even her motherhood. It was not simply that she had been born during a war. It was that the war had entered her earliest memories and shaped her inner world long before she understood its causes. Maria Beatrice's childhood was not defined by poverty, but by displacement. Not by violence she witnessed directly, but by the constant threat of it. Not by the absence of caregivers, but by the inability of those caregivers to shield her from fear. Even surrounded by wealth, she experienced a kind of homelessness that stayed with her for life. By the time she reached adolescence, she had lived in more temporary residences than many soldiers. Her identity became tied less to a place than to a family struggling to survive history's upheaval. And so, from her very first days, the princess who should have lived amid restored frescoes and marble palaces instead grew up with the quiet understanding that the world could crumble at any moment. A truth that would follow her into every chapter of her life. For most children, home is a single place. One set of walls, one familiar landscape, one circle of people who form the boundaries of their world. For Maria Beatrice of Austria-Este, home was a shifting constellation of rooms, corridors, and borrowed palaces, each one temporary, each one carrying the faint smell of unsettled dust and hurried departures. By the time she turned 4, Modena had already fallen to Napoleon's advancing armies, and the Este dynasty had lost the lands that defined them. From that moment on, her childhood became a long procession of exits. The family fled first to Vienna, the center of the Habsburg Empire, hoping that the capital's grandeur could provide a sense of safety. But Vienna, for all its ornate halls and sweeping avenues, was not home. It was refuge. Maria Beatrice quickly learned the difference. She never saw the city as a place she belonged to, but as a place where she waited. Each day felt provisional, every comfort lined with the knowledge that it might vanish as quickly as it had arrived. Letters from her mother reveal the depth of this instability. "The children sleep lightly," she wrote, "for they have learned that nighttime brings news." Even in the safety of the imperial palace, Maria Beatrice often woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hall. Messengers arriving with updates, servants preparing her family for yet another move, officials whispering behind closed doors. She absorbed the tension the way a child absorbs weather, never naming it, but always feeling it. When the family fled to Hungary, the sensation only deepened. Hungarian estates offered peaceful landscapes and wide countryside, but they too were temporary. To Maria Beatrice, every new residence felt like a stage set for a play that could be interrupted by war at any moment. She became cautious with attachments, hesitant to grow fond of gardens she might never see again, reluctant to cling to caregivers who might not remain with the household through another move. One governess recalled that the young princess always kept her favorite toy, a small carved horse, ready to pack. She never left it in a separate room or allowed it to be placed on a shelf. It traveled with her constantly, tucked under her pillow or held in her fist. She behaved as if everything she owned might disappear, the governess wrote. Even happiness. Her siblings, too young to understand the situation, adapted in different ways. Some grew clingy, crying during moves. Others became restless and wild, using the sprawling palaces as a playground to escape an atmosphere they could not explain. Maria Beatrice, by contrast, internalized the instability. She became quiet, observant, and wary, always scanning the room, always alert to the slightest shift in adult expression. Her fear was not dramatic, it was constant. This hyper-awareness became one of her defining traits. Visitors to the Habsburg household often remarked on her seriousness, while other children laughed loudly or ran through hallways. She walked softly, as if fearful of breaking the thin layer of stillness that held her world together. She had the posture of someone who wanted to be small enough not to disturb anything around her. Her parents did what they could to create a sense of normalcy. Her father, Archduke Ferdinand, continued to perform administrative duties in exile, often gathering his children to teach them about their heritage, their lost lands, and the responsibilities they would one day inherit. He hoped that reminding them of Modena and Massa would preserve their connection to the territories they had abandoned. But for Maria Beatrice, these stories were not comforting. They were reminders of something she had never been allowed to experience. Her mother, Maria Beatrice d'Este, prayed that their displacement would be temporary. She decorated their temporary residences with Este heirlooms, tapestries carried from Modena, portraits saved during the flight, ceremonial objects that offered a fragile link to the world they had lost. Yet to the young princess, these objects were more like relics than memories. They belonged to a life she had been born into, but had never truly lived. Even as the family tried to preserve a sense of unity, the atmosphere of fear was impossible to hide. Servants whispered about troop movements. Officials arrived with urgent documents. The adults spoke in coded language about danger, pressure, and deteriorating circumstances. Maria Beatrice learned to read these words in the tightening posture of her parents, in the way her mother's hands moved faster when folding clothing, in the way her father looked out windows with an expression she could not decipher. Her childhood friendships were fleeting. In each place they stayed, she met other noble children, but she rarely saw any of them twice. The goodbyes, always hurried, always sudden, taught her that relationships were fragile and temporary. She learned not to expect anyone to remain in her life for long. This emotional rootlessness shaped her more deeply than her royal lineage. Even when the war quieted and her family settled into a more stable environment, the internal instability remained. She continued to carry herself like someone who expected the ground beneath her to shift. One maid described her posture as a constant leaning inward, as if bracing for an impact that never came. By the time she reached adolescence, she could recall dozens of staircases, dozens of windows, and dozens of courtyards. But none of them felt like hers. She had lived in Vienna, in Hungary, in various Habsburg estates, yet she belonged nowhere. She remained a princess without a homeland, a child raised on the fragile edges of empire. This rootlessness would leave an imprint on her adulthood, shaping the anxieties that deepened in marriage, the vulnerabilities that emerged during motherhood, and the loneliness that settled into her final years. She entered each new chapter of her life with a heart trained by exile, a heart that expected loss long before it arrived. As Maria Beatrice entered adulthood, the wars that had shaped her childhood began to settle into uneasy peace. The map of Europe had been redrawn, thrones had fallen and risen, and alliances shifted like tides. Amid these tremors, the Habsburgs, ever practical, began arranging marriages that would strengthen the fractured empire. For Maria Beatrice, quiet, anxious, and still carrying the shadows of her displaced childhood, marriage was not presented as a question. It was an instruction. She was 20, modest in demeanor, gentle in manner, and known for a kind of fragile grace. But more important to the court was her lineage. As the daughter of an Este duchess and a Habsburg archduke, her bloodline carried political significance. And so, the imperial family selected a husband who matched that significance. Archduke Charles of Austria, one of the most celebrated military figures of the Napoleonic Wars, a national hero, and a man revered across Europe for his strategic brilliance. On paper, their marriage made perfect sense. It reunited two powerful branches of the Habsburg dynasty. It symbolized victory and stability after decades of upheaval. It was a union meant to secure the political future of territories that had been threatened, lost, and slowly reclaimed. But for Maria Beatrice, this marriage was a home she had no hand in choosing. And for Charles, she was not the woman he had once wished to marry. Years earlier, Archduke Charles had fallen deeply in love with a woman outside the narrow circle of acceptable Habsburg brides. He had wanted to marry her, had pleaded for the chance, but the imperial court refused. A general of the empire, a member of the most significant royal house in Europe, could not be permitted to marry for love. Duty demanded otherwise. By the time he was forced to abandon the woman he cared for, something in him had hardened. When Maria Beatrice was presented as his future bride, Charles accepted the match with the same discipline he applied to military strategy. He did not object, he did not protest, but he did not rejoice. His letters from this period reveal a tone of resignation, polite, respectful, but devoid of warmth. He understood that marriage was a political tool, not a personal refuge. Maria Beatrice entered this union without illusions, but not without hope. Like many young noblewomen, she had been raised on softened stories of royal marriages, tales in which affection sometimes grew from duty, and companionship could be found through shared responsibility. But her life had rarely rewarded hope. And from the first weeks of their marriage, she sensed that this new chapter would not be different. Charles was not cruel. He was not angry, nor dismissive, nor unfaithful. He was simply absent, emotionally removed, buried in military reports, administrative tasks, and the ceaseless responsibilities that came with being one of Europe's great commanders. Even at home, he carried the posture of a man still standing on a battlefield. He spoke little, ate quietly, and spent long hours in private study. Maria Beatrice tried to bridge the distance. She wrote notes to him, inviting conversation, She sought advice from older archduchesses on how to create a warm household. She attended dinners, hoping that shared evenings would open a path toward understanding. But Charles, disciplined and withdrawn, kept himself contained behind layers of duty. He did not know how to make room for someone else's emotions. The mismatch between them became evident to the court. Courtiers noted that the Archduke treated his wife with correctness, but not intimacy. He escorted her in public, but their private interactions were quiet, almost perfunctory. One diplomat wrote that the couple's marriage resembled a partnership between two dignified strangers. Meanwhile, Maria Beatrice felt the old instability of her childhood returning, not in the form of fleeing armies, but in the emotional uncertainty that filled her days. She never knew what version of her husband she would encounter. The silent general, the distant administrator, or the courteous but unreachable companion. The palace once again became a place where she felt like a guest rather than a resident. Her attempts to adapt were gentle and earnest. She immersed herself in small domestic routines, hoping to create spaces of peace, arranging flowers, overseeing needlework, caring for caged songbirds, reading in sunlit corridors. She found comfort in tasks that did not leave room for disappointment. But the quiet she surrounded herself with gradually turned into isolation. To those around her, she appeared graceful, composed, and obedient, a model archduchess. But those who observed more closely saw the sorrow behind her composure. One lady-in-waiting later wrote, "She was as polite as porcelain and just as breakable." For Charles, the marriage fulfilled its political purpose. For Maria Beatrice, it opened a new chapter of loneliness. One lived not in exile, but within the echoing grandeur of a palace where she felt unseen. Her childhood had stolen her sense of security. Her marriage began to steal her sense of self, and in the years that followed, motherhood, traditionally a royal woman's source of joy and identity, would deepen her heartbreak in ways she was never prepared to endure. Motherhood entered Maria Beatrice's life not as a season of joy, but as a test that seemed determined to break her spirit. In the grand halls of the Habsburg court, childbirth was both a duty and a spectacle, a way to secure dynastic legacy, to strengthen political alliances, to demonstrate stability after decades of war. But for Maria Beatrice, every pregnancy carried not celebration, but a trembling fear. Her own body, already worn by years of stress, felt fragile long before motherhood demanded its toll. Her first pregnancies were met with optimism by the court, but inside her private chambers, the experience was far from triumphant. Labor was long and exhausting, leaving her weak for months afterward. And while her surviving children were welcomed with joy, the losses that soon followed left a mark that would never fade. 3 of her children died in infancy, small, quiet deaths that occurred not in dramatic illness, but in the slow, silent fading of fragile newborn bodies. For most mothers, grief comes with cries, with emotional release, with the support of loved ones. But Maria Beatrice grieved the way she had lived, quietly, inwardly, with a silence that even those closest to her struggled to understand. One lady-in-waiting remembered entering the nursery after the death of the princess's second child and finding Maria Beatrice standing motionless beside the cradle. She did not cry, the attendant wrote. She simply placed her hand on the child's blanket, as if hoping warmth might return. Her letters from these years reveal a woman losing faith in the very rhythm of life. In one private note, she confessed, "I fear opening the nursery door each morning, for I do not know which child will still be breathing." It was a sentence too heavy for her youth, too haunting for the glittering expectations of an imperial archduchess. Her pregnancies came one after another, each weakening her already delicate health. Chronic headaches, fainting spells, and bouts of breathlessness plagued her. Doctors called her constitution sensitive, but what they truly meant was that her body, shaped by a childhood of anxiety and instability, lacked the resilience demanded of royal motherhood. Every birth deepened her exhaustion. Every loss amplified her sorrow. While her husband, Archduke Charles, respected her role as mother, he did not engage emotionally with the tragedies that unfolded in their household. His temperament, shaped by military discipline, personal restraint, and the burden of national responsibility, left little room for tenderness. When children died, he mourned in silence, then returned to his work. When Maria Beatrice wept quietly in her room, he offered polite concern, but no true solace. She learned once again what she had learned in childhood, that the people closest to her could not shield her from suffering. And so she built emotional walls around herself, not out of coldness, but out of self-preservation. The surviving children brought her moments of joy, but even those moments were haunted by fear. She watched over them with an intensity that worried her attendants. She checked their breathing at night. She insisted on being notified the moment one coughed or cried differently. A maid recalled that the princess hovered like a guardian spirit, as if her presence alone could keep death away. In this period, she began withdrawing from court life. The glittering salons, the concerts, the diplomatic gatherings, all felt foreign to her, shallow compared to the depth of her private grief. She preferred quiet activities, embroidery in the early morning, reading by candlelight, overseeing the education of her surviving children. These small rituals gave her day structure, but they also deepened her isolation. Her household, once expected to be lively with children's laughter, became subdued. Servants spoke in lowered voices. Curtains were drawn more often than not. Visitors described the atmosphere of her chambers as muted, as if the air itself had learned to grieve. Yet, in her stillness, there was no self-pity, only a deep fatigue that aged her far beyond her years. Contemporary accounts describe her appearance changing rapidly in her 30s, her posture drooping, her eyes darkening, her energy fading. One court official noted that she had the look of a woman who had lived 3 lives in one. The Habsburg world around her continued to function with its usual formality: balls, ceremonies, military parades. Yet inside her home, time moved differently. It moved according to the fragile rhythms of her children's health, the uncertainty of her own body, and the lingering memory of the small coffins that had once been carried quietly out of the palace. Motherhood, which in royal narratives is often described as a woman's fulfillment, brought Maria Beatrice nothing but a cycle of fear, attachment, and devastating loss. Her children became her world, yet that world constantly threatened to collapse. By the end of this chapter of her life, she had come to understand a truth she never dared to speak aloud: that even love, especially love, made her vulnerable to the kind of sorrow she no longer had the strength to bear. And as her family grew, as duties multiplied, as her body weakened further, her marriage, already emotionally distant, began to feel less like a union and more like a quiet, dignified loneliness carried within the walls of imperial splendor. As the years unfolded, the marriage between Maria Beatrice and Archduke Charles settled into a pattern that resembled coexistence more than companionship. To the outside world, they appeared dignified, steady, even admirable. A celebrated general and his gentle archduchess, fulfilling their duties with quiet precision. But behind the ceremonial facade, a cold emptiness defined their household. The emotional distance between them, present since their wedding, had grown into a permanent landscape neither seemed able or willing to cross. Archduke Charles was a man shaped by war. His youth had been spent on battlefields, commanding troops, writing strategies, enduring defeats, and celebrating victories. He had saved the empire more than once, and the Habsburg dynasty revered him as one of its greatest living heroes. Yet war had not simply marked his career. It had shaped his inner life. He thought in lines, in orders, in disciplined conclusions. He approached the world with the restrained caution of someone who had learned to survive by suppressing emotion. Even in domestic moments, he carried the same sense of detachment. He read military reports during breakfast, disappeared into his study for hours without announcement, and returned to family rooms with the distant air of a man still standing on an invisible battlefield. He was not unkind. He was not cruel, but he was profoundly unavailable. Maria Beatrice, who had grown up surrounded by instability and fear, longed for reassurance, something simple, like a warm sentence at the end of a difficult day, or a moment of shared silence that did not feel empty. But Charles offered none of these. His presence, even when physically close, created no comfort. She often felt more alone with him than she did when sitting by herself in her private rooms. Their dinners reflected the tone of their relationship: polite, structured, and unbearably quiet. Servants later recalled that they rarely witnessed the couple exchange more than a few sentences during meals. Charles would discuss logistics, troop movements, administrative reforms, or agricultural data. Maria Beatrice listened respectfully, but spoke little, partly out of habit and partly because she felt her words slid off him like rain on armor. She did not blame him. Part of her believed she was simply not the woman he would ever have chosen. Another part believed she was not worthy of being chosen in the first place, an insecurity born from the constant instability of her childhood. But whatever the reason, she slowly accepted that this marriage, built on duty rather than affection, would never become a source of emotional shelter. When children died, the gap between them widened further. Maria Beatrice carried grief like a weight lodged in her chest, while Charles processed loss with a soldier's restraint. He mourned each child's death, but in silence. He seldom spoke of them, perhaps because he believed emotion was a luxury a commander could not afford. For his wife, silence was not strength. It was abandonment. One chambermaid wrote that after the death of their third infant, Maria Beatrice sat in the nursery for hours, unable to leave the room. Charles entered once, placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, then left without a word. He meant to comfort her, the maid wrote. But she looked as though the touch had passed through her instead of grounding her. Slowly, she withdrew from him, not in anger, but in a quiet surrender. She stopped trying to open conversations. She no longer waited in the evenings for him to join her. She no longer hoped for tenderness. Instead, she built a different life within the palace, one composed of small, survivable spaces. Her study filled with letters and religious books, her embroidery room where she stitched until her hands trembled, and the nursery where she held her surviving children close with a devotion that bordered on fragility. Her household grew to reflect the emotional atmosphere she lived in. The staff walked softly, as if not to disturb an unseen sorrow. Music was seldom played. Curtains were drawn more often than not. Flowers wilted before they were replaced. Visitors remarked on the stillness that hung in the air of her rooms, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like resignation. Charles, for his part, saw her sadness, but did not know what to do with it. His sense of duty extended to providing for her physically, ensuring she was respected at court and granting her the privacy she desired. But he did not understand the emotional language she needed. He believed he was being considerate by giving her space. She interpreted it as abandonment. Yet even as their marriage drifted into parallel lives, Maria Beatrice remained respectful, soft-spoken, and dutiful. She attended the ceremonies required of her, greeted guests with gentle courtesy, and carried herself with dignity. But those who looked closely saw the hollowness in her expression, the way her eyes seemed to search for something that never appeared. Her loneliness deepened, not because she was unloved by everyone, but because she was unseen by the one person who should have been closest to her. In a palace filled with people, she became emotionally invisible, like a figure wandering through vast halls without leaving footprints. By the time she entered her 40s, the emotional distance in her marriage was no longer a wound. It was simply the shape of her life. She had accepted it, internalized it, and stopped expecting anything different. But the years of sorrow, loss, and silence were not without consequence. They began to leave marks on her health, subtle at first, then devastating. And soon, the grief she carried, not just as a mother, but as a wife, would begin to manifest in her body, eroding her strength in ways even she could no longer ignore. By the time Maria Beatrice reached her early 40s, the toll of her life, its instability, its losses, its emotional isolation, had begun to carve itself visibly into her body. She had never been robust, even in youth. Governesses had once described her as delicate as pressed flowers, a child who startled at sudden noises and fatigued easily. But the fragility that was once merely temperament slowly hardened into chronic illness. What began as small discomforts, fatigue, headaches, faintness, deepened into symptoms that alarmed even the most seasoned physicians of the imperial court. She experienced sudden bouts of breathlessness. Her heartbeat fluttered unpredictably, sometimes racing, sometimes slowing, until she felt dizzy. Long walks became impossible. Even short conversations exhausted her. Doctors were summoned, consulted, replaced by others, each offering a different explanation. Some blamed weak nerves, a diagnosis routinely given to women who lived quiet, sorrow-filled lives. Others suspected lingering effects of repeated childbirth. A few whispered that her heart was failing under the accumulated weight of too many pregnancies, too many anxieties, too many years spent living in a household where she carried loneliness like an invisible chain. What none of them said aloud, but several noted privately, was that grief itself had become an illness in her. It had seeped into her like cold water through the cracks of a stone wall, slow and unrelenting. Maria Beatrice herself sensed this truth, though she never dared to speak it. She would sometimes pause while climbing the palace stairs, placing her hand against the wall as though steadying herself not only against physical weakness, but against memories that threatened to overwhelm her. Servants noticed how often she stood at windows without actually looking at the scenery, her gaze drifting inward toward a place no one else could see. Her surviving children, now older, felt the change as well. They saw how she moved more slowly, how she smiled without the warmth of earlier years, how her hands trembled slightly when she tried to stitch embroidery. Her eldest daughter once wrote that her mother had the sadness of someone constantly listening for footsteps that never come. A sorrow that was both present and distant, familiar and unreachable. The emotional distance in her marriage only worsened her health. Charles remained respectful and proper, ensuring she had whatever comforts medicine or wealth could provide. But he did not step into the emotional breach. He approached her declining strength the way he did all things, as a situation requiring management rather than understanding. He recommended doctors, approved treatments, ordered rest, yet never saw that what she needed most was something he had never learned to give. His attempts to help were practical, not personal. When she grew too weak to attend certain court functions, he excused her with dignity. When she suffered long nights of pain, he ensured her rooms were supplied with fresh linens, warmed coals, and quiet attendance. But he never stayed at her bedside. He never asked, in a voice filled with human concern, how she truly felt. Maria Beatrice did not resent him. She simply recognized what she had always known, that hers was a marriage held together by duty, not by the kind of companionship that could soften the edges of suffering. And so she endured her illness as she had endured everything, quietly, with an inward resignation that frightened those who cared for her. Her world shrank as her health declined. She began spending entire days inside her private suite, the windows partially shuttered, the rooms dim and silent. She no longer walked in the gardens she once loved. She no longer rode in carriages through Vienna's broad boulevards. Even the sound of court musicians, once a gentle pleasure, now felt overwhelming to her weakened heart. Her attendants adjusted their routines. They spoke softly, moved lightly, and kept watch for signs of distress. One maid remarked that serving the Archduchess felt like tending to a fragile flame, one that flickered dangerously each time the wind changed. Yet despite the careful management of her illness, nothing reversed the decline. There were days when she felt stronger, when she could read for an hour or sit with her children. But these moments were fleeting. They were followed by long stretches of exhaustion that left her unable to rise from bed. In these final years, visitors described her as prematurely aged, not in appearance alone, but in spirit. She had the demeanor of someone who had lived through storms without ever finding shelter, someone who had carried the weight of decades inside a heart that was never meant to bear so much. Still, she did not complain. She did not ask for sympathy. Her nature, shaped since childhood, had always leaned toward quiet endurance. She had learned early that life did not reward protest. It rewarded survival, however fragile that survival might be. But even survival has limits. And as the shadows lengthened around her, it became clear to all who observed her that her body, already delicate from birth, was losing the long battle against a lifetime of sorrow. The war that had uprooted her childhood, the marriage that offered no solace, the children she had buried, the loneliness she carried in silence. They had all accumulated inside her like invisible scars. And now, after years of fighting against the unspoken wounds of her life, her heart began to surrender. As illness tightened its grip on her, Maria Beatrice's world gradually contracted until it became a set of quiet rooms, hushed corridors, and brief, fragile moments of company. The life of an archduchess, once defined by ceremonies, obligations, and the subtle politics of court, narrowed into a life marked by silence. Even the sunlight seemed to enter her chambers differently in these years, falling softly across her bed as though wary of disturbing her. Her physical weakness isolated her first. She could no longer walk the length of the palace without stopping to catch her breath. She no longer appeared at concerts or receptions, choosing instead to remain in her chambers where she could control the rhythm of her days. What began as medical necessity slowly became emotional preference. The noise of court life, the chatter, the laughter, the political bargaining, exhausted her in ways she could not articulate. She preferred the company of soft voices, or, more often, no voices at all. Attendants who had served her for years learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression. When she needed help, when she wished to be left alone, when pain was overtaking her. They respected her silences, though those silences made them uneasy. One lady-in-waiting later wrote, "She moved through the palace like someone who feared becoming a burden, even to the walls themselves. Her children, now old enough to sense the fragility of her condition, visited her often. They sat beside her bed, reading aloud or telling her of their lessons, their games, their small triumphs. She listened with a gentle attentiveness, but her smiles were tinged with fatigue. She tried to hide her pain from them. Yet children understand more than adults assume. They knew she was fading, even if no one spoke the truth aloud. For Maria Beatrice, these moments with her children were bittersweet. She cherished them deeply, fearing each visit might be the last time she saw them with clarity. But their presence also reminded her of the children she had lost, faces she could never forget, absences that spread like shadows in the corners of her memory. Every laugh she heard carried the echo of the silence left by those who had gone before. Her marriage, already distant long before her illness, entered a final stage of emotional detachment. Archduke Charles continued to perform his duties as a husband in the way he understood them, ensuring doctors attended her regularly, making certain she lacked nothing in comfort, providing resources for any treatment suggested by the court physicians. But he remained emotionally unreachable. He visited her rooms at scheduled times, stayed only briefly, and spoke primarily of neutral topics: weather, minor administrative issues, ceremonial matters. To him, such visits were expressions of respect. To her, they were reminders of how little he understood her inner world. He would sit by her side, his posture impeccable, hands folded neatly as though still in uniform. He rarely touched her hand unless required by etiquette. He rarely asked how she truly felt, perhaps because he feared an answer he did not know how to address. His restraint, once a sign of discipline, had hardened into a barrier neither of them had the strength to dismantle. In the privacy of her own thoughts, Maria Beatrice no longer blamed him. She had, in a quiet, sorrowful way, forgiven him long ago, not because he had changed, but because she had stopped expecting anything from him. Expectations had only ever brought her disappointment, so she accepted him as he was, distant, dutiful, and incapable of offering the comfort she needed. Court society, meanwhile, moved around her with polite indifference. Illness was common in palaces. Grief was almost expected. Melancholy was treated as a feminine condition rather than a human one. Few people noticed the gradual disappearance of Maria Beatrice from public life. She had never been a political force, never wielded influence, never caused scandal. Her absence was therefore considered unremarkable, even natural. History begins to forget a person long before they die, and Maria Beatrice was already being erased in this quiet, painless way. The palace gardens outside her windows continued to bloom each spring, though she was no longer well enough to walk among them. She would sit by the window instead, wrapped in blankets despite the mild weather, watching leaves move in the breeze. These tiny, wordless gestures of nature brought her more comfort than any royal ceremony ever had. In them, she found something close to peace. Yet even in this peace, she felt intensely alone. It was not the loneliness of childhood, filled with fear and confusion, but the loneliness of adulthood, an understanding that she had lived a life largely unshared. Her thoughts, her wounds, her small joys her vast griefs. Most of them had belonged only to her. Occasionally, she tried to confide in her confessor, seeking spiritual solace. But even these conversations were gentle fragments rather than full revelations. Religious comfort helped, but it did not erase the sorrow woven into the fibers of her life. As the final years continued, those close to her noticed something subtle but unmistakable. She was letting go. Not dramatically, not in despair, but in a slow, graceful surrender. She spent more time resting, more time praying, more time simply existing without expectation. She became softer, quieter, an ember slowly cooling rather than a flame extinguished suddenly. Her life had begun with flight and fear, continued through duty and grief, and now entered its final stage marked by stillness. Yet within this stillness lay the truth she had never spoken aloud, that she had lived most of her life unseen, unheard, and unheld. And in these quiet rooms, surrounded by the gentle flickering of candles and the muted sounds of a palace continuing without her, Maria Beatrice waited. Not for a miracle, not for recovery, but for rest. By the late 1830s, Maria Beatrice's strength had dwindled to the point where each day felt like a negotiation with her own body. Her world, once shaped by exile, duty, and motherhood, had now narrowed into the fragile dimensions of a bedroom dimly lit by candles and filtered sunlight. The palace around her continued its rhythms, servants carrying trays down long corridors, officials discussing administrative concerns, the distant murmur of the imperial court. But these sounds reached her as though from another world, softened by distance and fading consciousness. Her decline was not abrupt. It stretched across months, perhaps years, a slow erosion rather than a collapse. Some days she stabilized enough to sit near the window and look out at the gardens. On others, she could barely lift her head from the pillow. The women who tended to her grew accustomed to the unpredictability. They entered her chambers quietly, preparing her medicines with practiced motions, adjusting her pillows, brushing her hair with a gentleness reserved for the gravely ill. Those who saw her in these final months described her as almost translucent. Her skin pale, her hands thin, her voice softened to a whisper. The fragility that had always been part of her nature now appeared like a physical truth carved into her bones. She seemed to fade not only in strength, but in presence, as though her spirit had begun a slow retreat from the world long before her body would follow. Her husband, Archduke Charles, maintained his visits with the same regularity he brought to all matters of duty. He entered her chambers with measured steps, asked after her health, and remained for the appropriate length of time. His face carried a reserved sorrow, perhaps genuine, perhaps a reflection of the gravity of the situation. But he did not linger. He did not break the disciplined distance he had cultivated all his life. To some, his composure seemed cold. To others, it was simply the only way he knew how to grieve. Maria Beatrice, for her part, greeted him with politeness. She did not expect comfort. She had long since made peace with the emotional distance between them. In her final days, she no longer hoped for tenderness from him. She simply accepted his presence as part of the life she had been given, an unchangeable fact like the shape of the palace walls or the formality of court ceremonies. Her surviving children visited often, their faces marked with the fear and confusion that accompanies watching a parent fade. They brought her flowers from the gardens, drawings, small objects from their lessons. She touched their hands, smiled weakly, murmured blessings. But even their presence seemed to drain her, reminding her of all she had lost and all she would soon be separated from. One daughter later wrote that her mother had the look of someone already standing between two worlds. a quiet acceptance of her fate that was both heartbreaking and strangely serene. As summer turned to autumn in 1840, the signs that her life was nearing its end became impossible to ignore. Her breathing grew shallow and irregular. She slept for long stretches, waking confused and exhausted. She ate almost nothing. Even sitting up required assistance. The physicians who attended her spoke in low voices, cautious not to alarm the family, but their expressions revealed the truth. Her heart, weakened by years of strain and sorrow, was failing. In those final weeks, Maria Beatrice spoke very little. Words took effort she no longer had. Instead, she communicated through soft gestures, a faint nod, a slight squeeze of the hand, a distant gaze that seemed to follow something no one else could see. Perhaps she was remembering the landscapes of her childhood, the places she had fled, the children she had buried, the fleeting moments of happiness that had come and gone like brief bursts of sunlight across storm clouds. On September 14th, 1840, surrounded by a handful of attendants and a priest who recited prayers in a hushed tone, Maria Beatrice breathed her last. Her death was quiet, so quiet that those at her bedside barely registered the moment. There was no struggle, no dramatic final gesture. She simply slipped away, as softly and silently as she had lived. Word of her passing spread through the palace not with shock, but with solemn acknowledgement. Many had already sensed that the Archduchess was nearing the end of her long, sorrow-filled journey. Servants bowed their heads. Courtiers offered polite condolences. The imperial household prepared the necessary arrangements with efficient professionalism. Archduke Charles, informed by his staff, responded with dignity. He attended to the funeral preparations, received condolences, and maintained composure throughout the ceremonies. Those present noted that he appeared thoughtful, even somber, but not devastated. His grief, like everything else in his life, remained contained within the disciplined boundaries he had always lived by. The funeral itself was formal, precise, and unsurprising, befitting her rank, yet lacking personal warmth. There were hymns, attendants dressed in black, and the solemn procession expected of an archduchess. But no one wept openly. No one spoke of her with a fervent emotion reserved for beloved public figures. She had been too quiet, too private, too invisible for that. And so Maria Beatrice left the world much as she had lived in it, quietly, gently, without demanding space or attention. Her story did not echo through the courts of Europe. No chroniclers wrote dramatic tales of her life. No statues were erected in her honor. Her existence faded into the vast tapestry of Habsburg history, a delicate, nearly invisible thread overshadowed by louder and more powerful lives. Yet for those who had truly observed her, for the attendants who saw her tears, for the children who loved her, for the few who witnessed the quiet endurance she carried through every tragedy, her life was not small. It was simply unspoken. A life marked not by triumph or scandal, but by survival. A heart worn down not by a single tragedy, but by the long, relentless accumulation of many. And in the end, she left the world in the same way she had walked through it, softly, humbly, almost unnoticed. In the years that followed Maria Beatrice's death, her name began to slip quietly out of memory. First from the daily conversations of the palace, then from the public consciousness, then from the histories written by those who chronicled the great dramas of Europe. She had lived in one of the most powerful dynasties on the continent, in an era defined by war, revolution, and political upheaval. Yet she left behind almost no imprint on the grand narrative of her time. Part of this fading was inevitable. History, as written by the victors and the ambitious, has always favored those who commanded armies, shaped borders, orchestrated rebellions, or sparked scandals. Archduke Charles, her husband, had his name etched into countless military accounts. Her Habsburg relatives filled the pages of diplomacy and politics. Even distant cousins were remembered through their eccentricities or tragedies. But Maria Beatrice, quiet, dutiful, gentle, withdrawn, did not fit the mold of those history chose to preserve. She had produced children, yet most of them did not live long enough to ensure a legacy. She had lived in palaces, yet never wielded influence. She had endured hardships, yet never caused controversy. Her life had been a long, steady whisper overshadowed by the thunderous voices around her. And whispers, unless carefully protected, are easily lost to time. The palace staff who once served her retired or were reassigned. New generations of courtiers arrived, barely aware of the Archduchess who had once moved gently through the same corridors. Her apartments were eventually reassigned to other members of the imperial family, redecorated, repurposed, and stripped of the small touches that had once made them hers: embroidered cushions, religious books, delicate objects she arranged in comfortable patterns. It was as though she had never lived there at all. Those who did remember her remembered a version of her filtered through silence. A housemaid described her as the quiet shadow who walked the palace gardens. A governess referred to her as gentle, kind, but fading even while alive. A distant relative referred to her in a letter merely as poor Beatrice, a fragile soul. These memories, passed privately, never crystallized into any broader narrative. They remained personal, unrecorded fragments. Meanwhile, in Modena and Massa, lands of her maternal inheritance, her name barely appeared in the lineages and chronicles that celebrated the dukes and duchesses who once ruled there. She had been born at the edge of an era that was crumbling and died at the beginning of another that had little interest in looking back. Her Italian heritage, rich and complex, was swept aside by the enormous political changes brought by Napoleon and later by the movements toward Italian unification. In this new world, the quiet Archduchess, whose life had been shaped by displacement, found herself displaced once again, this time from the very memory of the places she had never been allowed to truly call home. Even within the Habsburg archives, her presence was limited to formal records. Birth certificates, marriage documents, notes on children lost in infancy, brief references to her declining health. These records traced the outline of a life, but revealed nothing of the suffering that filled it. They listed dates, not emotions. Events, not wounds. No letters she wrote survived in public collections. No diaries were preserved. No personal reflections. No confessions. No pieces of her inner world remain. The silence she cultivated in life became permanent in death. Historians, encountering her name, often refer to her as one of the lesser-known archduchesses, or a figure of limited political relevance. Such descriptions, though technically accurate, strip her existence down to a shadow, precisely the thing she had unintentionally become. Yet the truth of Maria Beatrice's life cannot be measured by political impact. It must be measured by the human experiences that shaped her. A childhood of exile, where fear seeped into her bones, a marriage built on duty rather than affection, repeated losses that carved deep sorrow into her heart. Years of emotional solitude that left her spirit fragile, an illness that reflected the cumulative weight of everything she had endured. Her tragedy was not spectacular. It did not erupt in scandal or violence. It unfolded slowly, like a candle burning quietly in a drafty room, its flame gradually weakening until only a wisp of smoke remained. This makes her story no less important. In many ways, Maria Beatrice represents the countless noblewomen, indeed, countless women across history, whose lives were shaped by forces they could not control, and whose stories were deemed too quiet to preserve. Women who moved through grand palaces without truly inhabiting them, who bore children in fear and grief, who lived in marriages built not on love, but on dynastic calculation, who suffered silently and disappeared silently. Her life forces us to recognize the emotional undercurrent that traditional history often ignores, the private tragedies that unfolded behind tapestries and gilded doors, unseen and unrecorded. It reminds us that suffering does not need to be dramatic to be profound, that invisibility can be its own form of pain, and that the quietest stories often reveal the most about the human cost of empire. In the end, perhaps the true legacy of Maria Beatrice lies not in what she changed, but in what she endured. In the tenderness she offered her children, even as her heart broke. In the resilience she maintained through exile, grief, and loneliness. In the grace with which she bore a life that offered her little comfort. Her name may fade from history books, but her story, once seen, cannot be unseen. It lingers as a reminder that even the most forgotten lives can hold immense, silent depth, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies are those that leave barely a trace at all. In the end, Maria Beatrice's life reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who bend empires, command armies, or ignite revolutions. It is also shaped, quietly, invisibly, by those who endure. Her story contains no dramatic rebellion, no political triumph, no moment that forces its way into textbooks. Instead, it contains the quiet truth that even lives lived in palaces can be defined by sorrow, fragility, and unspoken pain. She entered the world as the daughter of two powerful dynasties. Yet from her very first breath, her life followed a path she never chose. Exile in childhood, duty in marriage, grief in motherhood, and illness in adulthood. Every stage of her life was shaped by forces larger than herself: war, politics, expectation. Yet her suffering unfolded in the gentlest, most private corners of the imperial world. Maria Beatrice's tragedy was not sudden, but cumulative. It grew from years of instability, from emotional distance in her marriage, from the unbearable loss of children, from the weight of a heart that carried more sorrow than it could hold. She lived quietly, died quietly, and was quietly forgotten. But there is something profoundly human in her quietness. Her story forces us to look beyond crowns and titles, beyond grand portraits and marble halls, and to remember that royalty did not shield a person from loneliness, grief, or longing. Behind every ceremonial procession, behind every title etched into a genealogy, lived real people with fragile inner worlds. People who bled, hoped, feared, and broke. Maria Beatrice was one of them. She did not reshape history, but she reveals the cost of history, the emotional toll borne by those trapped within dynasties that expected endurance without complaint. Her life, though nearly erased by time, holds a truth worth remembering: that suffering is not less real simply because it is silent. And so, her story ends not with triumph, but with recognition. A recognition that behind forgotten names lie entire worlds of feeling. A recognition that the quietest hearts often carry the heaviest burdens. And a recognition that even a life almost lost to history can still speak, softly, gently, if we take the time to listen.